Is a keynote from Peter Coaldrake, the Vice-Chancellor of Queensland University of Technology. Please welcome him. Thank
you. Thanks very much, Deb. Good morning, everyone. I'm in the last few weeks of a lengthy term as a Vice-Chancellor, and some people in my position over the years have used the opportunity of an occasion like this to let go. And to be vaguely irresponsible. Well, I don't have any such temptation. It might be because I'm an optimist, but I also know, and it really takes off from Ralph's point, there is no time that has been as important as this time in terms of the importance of education and research in our community. The more so, given the loss of faith in institutions which we see around us. Indeed, perhaps a loss of faith by students in our institutions that studies will necessarily have the sure outcomes that they might have had before, but we come back to that in a little while. But I'd actually like, in terms of the uplifting theme that Deb's referred to, I'd just like to remind us that the Australian higher education system in general, the university sector in particular, is overall in pretty strong shape, certainly by international standards. We have a system in which almost 40% of people who are young people, 25, 34, have degrees or are studying for degrees. There is some unevenness in the success of the demand-driven system in delivering that overall result. The demand-driven system really having done its job for metropolitan Australia, certainly in a metropolitan Australia, but having only made very modest gains in the outer metropolitan areas and certainly in the rural and regional areas. The Australian system also, from a government's perspective, is very good value for money if you look at public outlays by OECD standards and so on. Most universities have good operating margins. The sustainability of some of those, of course, is a matter which detains us all. The co-partner system, the HEC system, is now 30 years old, and it will inevitably continue to modify and change, but it's seen internationally as a very good example. I think TEXA, in terms of the part of the sector I know best, has actually done a good job. People will always be worried about regulation. People will always be worried about what's actually being monitored and the role of a body like TEXA. But I think we are seen to have robust regulatory arrangements here. And very relevantly, Australian universities are climbing up the international rankings, which, if you're in government, any government, is a reassuring statement around the quality of the system. I also think there are other reasons which are perhaps not quite so tangibly evidence-based, but I think there are some other signs or other reasons we should be optimistic. I think universities are actually beginning to take students very seriously. I think for a long, long time, universities didn't take students seriously because universities tend to be organised around the interests of their academic tribes. But that's changed very significantly, I think, in most of our institutions, and we should all be happy about that. And I do think that we are beginning to take very seriously indeed the reality that the waves of disruption that are washing across all the professional areas are washing across our universities, our education bodies more generally. So there are a whole lot of things I think that we actually should just reflect on and take stock of in terms of looking forward and looking back. For the challenges, we've said the good things, so what are the challenges? Well, we in the university sector part of this discussion tend to think it's all about us. If you're a federal government minister staying awake at night or first thing in the morning, and you're reflecting on the challenges that you face in your portfolio, the university sector is probably not going to be your first priority. I think the first substantive challenge is joining up the bits in the post-secondary environment. I know this was covered in some of the discussion yesterday. The link between schools, our vet system, and universities. I think it is a joining up of the post-secondary arrangements, which is number one challenge. We've talked already about the number of young Australians who go to university, nearly 40% overall, but 60% don't. And I think that element would be relevant to a minister. The vet sector in general has been the subject of repeated major upheavals. Both sides of politics across two levels of government have been complicit in this. There's been a lot of torture around the mixes of Commonwealth and state contributions to TAFE in particular, and I think we understand that there has been some hollowing out caused by the demand-driven system and by the extension of vet fee help. There is indeed an arbitrary line between education and training. Vet is focused on training, as it were, but vet should be educating, and indeed does. Universities do train as well as educate. The professional disciplines understand this firsthand. So if you're a minister, the first set of challenges I think you would be thinking about in your portfolio relate to the joining up of the system, the coherence of the system overall, not simply the issues around the universities, though the universities are the group that make the most noise. The second preoccupation as a minister would be just the unrelenting pressures on the public dollar. And I know these have been discussed yesterday by a number of speakers, including Bruce, and therefore there's no need for me to make remarks on them. But if you're in government, it is the cost of loans, the risks around repayment levels and so on, which would be preoccupying. And of course, associated with that would be graduate outcomes if employment prospects are soft, as they have been in the post-GFC environment. The third thing I would hope any minister would be worried about would be access and poverty. So, as I said at the outset, the weakest gains from the demand-driven system have been in the low socioeconomic areas. And if we don't want to have more of the Trumpist sort of tendencies that have been referred to in the previous session, then presumably we're interested in those matters. I think the demand-driven system has done its job in terms of the inner metropolitan areas, but it certainly has some way still to go in respect of the other catchments. The fifth concern I'd identify in terms of an interest of a minister would be student outcomes. I know there's been some interest in Minister Birmingham's commentary this week on attrition and completion rates. I actually have some sympathy with his concern in terms of the public investment and the expectations that governments have. As a Vice-Chancellor, I certainly am focused on those matters. It's worth reminding ourselves that we've always traded on the importance of the graduate premium, the value of having a degree to your life, the professional foundation that it provides your life and so on. And it's worth reminding ourselves that if you graduated from an Australian university in 1984, when participation rates were much lower, then 90% of graduates had full-time employment in a relevant field within 3 months. That figure had moved from 90% to 2014, post-GFC, to 70%. And of course, the figures this week have been the subject of a lot of commentary. I think in the same way that students are focused on these issues, so should universities be very jealously focused on them, as I'm indicating, a minister inevitably is. I think for any government, for any minister, research funding is a real conundrum, because it is frankly impossible for any government to satisfy the demands for research funding that will come in from the institutions. So you can't please the sector as a whole. What should probably worry us most is if the access to research, competitive research funding and so on, is so limited that the next generation of researchers is not encouraged. And you should be concerned if the R&D profile of universities is not related to industry and professional needs in research. And there has historically been a very significant disjunction between private and public R&D in this country. That might be explained in part because of the focus on engineering and engineering-related areas in terms of private sector R&D, and the strong concentration in medical and bioscience in the public institutions. But nevertheless, that alignment is an important matter. The last matter I just reflect on as a concern for government is the situation regarding international students. International students and the international student industry is a very strong industry for Australia, and we shouldn't talk that industry down. It's nevertheless relevant to reflect that universities, and a very large number of our universities, are extremely reliant on international student income, not just in Globo, but in business and commerce courses. And I don't, certainly the Audit and Risk Committee of my council, and I'm sure other councils around, university councils around the country, would be concerned about this issue. Because if 50 to 70% of enrolments in business and commerce courses on campuses in Australia, in particular universities, are international students, and they might be from one particular catchment of international students, that presumably is not only an economic matter, it's presumably a risk and quality matter. I'm not unsympathetic to the circumstances of universities which encourage very high numbers of international students to be admitted. We want international students. Of course we want international students in significant numbers to be an important part of a robust system. The risk is the concentration in one or two discipline areas. I've reflected on the challenges that ministers might perceive in looking at the higher education system generally, and universities in particular. In terms of now talking about universities in particular, the number one challenge, of course, most people have at this time of the year is balancing budgets and developing triennial budgets for the next 3 years. And the common refrain is, we don't know where we are, we've got a policy vacuum, the government hasn't been able to legislate, and we know that the 2014 package didn't get through, 15 package, which was the same, didn't get through, it was abandoned in 16, and a lighter version has been tried and failed in 2017. But you know what? It might be as good as it's going to get. It just might be. It's interesting to reflect on our recent history. There was a huge amount of investment made in the higher education system by the Gillard-Rudd government, 2009 to 2011. About $6 billion, I think, of new monies got injected into the system over that period, largely, of course, to grow the system, the criticism being that the investment wasn't going to sustain the system. But it was a very significant investment, and I think involved a lot of good public policy. But you know what's remembered from that period? The $1.8 billion that came out. We're not a sector that's necessarily generous to politicians and governments of the day. In fact, I think that universities in particular tend to deal much better with the opposition of the day than the government of the day, because the record with the government of the day is only going to be one of disappointment. But I say it might be as good as it's going to get, because government's dealing with the pressures they're dealing with, and the pressures are bipartisan. The pressures that governments are experiencing are going to be reflected in, for example, the mid-year statement, MyEFO, as much as in budget statements. And if you're a government facing the sorts of issues that the current government is facing, then and you can't get your legislation through, then you'll take off any spare change off the mantelpiece. And that spare change might be in the form of changes to HEP or research block grants, though one hopes not. But the government might have to, without legislation, seek to trim the system, either by capping enrolments and funding on enrolments, or some other device. So I'm saying the fact that we haven't had a package through might not actually be such a bad thing in practical budget terms, planning for the next year or two. And in terms of what follows, I think it's very important that universities are quite alive to the challenges that any government of any disposition will face in the future in meeting the sorts of expectations and requirements we have. So the first set of challenges, of course, the preoccupying short-term challenges relate to budget. The second relate to disruption and technology. I think the first national report that referred to technology in our sector was the West Review in about 1994. And it really heralded a discussion that matured 20 years later, nearly 20 years later, with the development of MOOCs and so on. MOOCs haven't broken down the system. Of course, technology is. But as I said at the outset, I think that universities are actually starting to understand the opportunities here. There are plenty of international examples. There are going to be plenty of mistakes made along the way. And I think we've got to distinguish between underlying movements that are occurring with fads that might be attractive in the short term. I don't think the risks around disruption are with the students. I'm sure that they will cope. And we know in our institutions that students are oftentimes well ahead of the rest of us. But the disruption challenges relate to our systems, whether they can cope, whether they can adapt, whether they can renew, and how we can achieve that. And I think the other challenge, digestion challenge here, relates to the academic model. The debates about the traditional notions of academic work, the models of all-rounders, who's going to be doing the teaching in the future. We've already had some discussion about this morning and plenty yesterday. But universities are conservative places. And it is the academic group in universities, in a range of disciplines in particular, which quite often are most challenged. I'm reminded in my own institution, which in the last 10 years has put a huge investment into the STEM disciplines. And we recognise that in order to be effective in that investment, we actually had to link up in a very serious way with the schools. And we've done that now for a number of years, involving large numbers of schools and so on. But the interest in STEM didn't come out of the education faculty. We've got a very good education faculty. They've clicked into it now. But it came out of the science and engineering faculty. And that reflected really a very conservative mindset within another part of the institution at the time. The next challenge really for universities relates to what we're actually delivering our students, and what we're delivering our students be actually what they want and what they need, as opposed to delivering what they think they should have and delivering it in a way in which we prefer to deliver it. Most of us, and I've heard discussion this morning and there was discussion yesterday, universities are having to entirely reconceptualise the way they deliver services. And there's already reference been made this morning about libraries and student focal points and so on. But I think this is actually a massively interesting area, and it is one which challenges some of our deepest romanticised conceptions. Also mentioned this morning, so I won't say much more about it now, is simply the whole question of soft skills. And that debate has so much moved on from deep technical and professional knowledge to the traditional soft skills to now encouraging students and hopefully ensuring that students have other qualities which will enable them to cope in the world ahead as opposed to the world we're currently in. This, in most universities, is seen in terms of initiatives to encourage student innovation and entrepreneurship. At QUT, like in most institutions, I don't know that we had a clue what we were doing 3 or 4 years ago when we embarked in a serious way in this area. But we knew that what we should be doing is providing places and spaces and opportunities for students to link up with industry, to link up with people with financial advice and so on. But we actually let it go and allowed the students to shape it and to influence us fairly fundamentally in that. And I think that's probably been probably had as coherent as an outcome as we might have expected. I've talked about the priorities for the challenges that government faces. I've talked briefly about the challenges that institutions face. Of course, for students, students want an experience which is relevant. They do still want jobs, though they don't see jobs and careers as they have done in the past, because they, much quicker than the older ones amongst us, have understood the changing world, the rapidly changing world, and the fact that they're going to be shifting occupationally and professionally and personally very much more often. So it is those skills so it is our responsibility to ensure that the skills we want them to have, to enable them to adapt, to be creative, to be resilient in the world, are the skills that we're providing them. I haven't gone over time. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. That was not just...
I was given a stern brief about timing.
We've made time up again. We might run straight to questions then.
Sure.
Can you elaborate on how the universities care about their students today with comparison to the past? You need to stand with the microphone. Sorry. That woke you up, didn't it?
Hopefully by trying to organise the services around what they want rather than what they assume. I made this comment in brief. In our institution, like I'm sure many others, over the years you've had departments, student welfare, student support, curriculum advice, pedagogical support, sporting assistance, whatever the services were. We actually, a couple of years ago, went out and surveyed some thousands of students and some hundreds of staff who were involved in the delivery of those services, and asked them how services should be provided to students in the future, what those who were providing services, what they thought of those services, and then we asked the students what they thought they needed. Interestingly enough, they all told us the same thing. So we basically reconceptualised all of that approach, the first phase of which in respect of students at our place is called HiQ, but other institutions are doing it. And so it was, if you like, an evidence-based piece of work seeking to establish what was wanted and seeking to respond to that. I guess also just saying that in doing so, there are going to be mistakes along the way.
Sure.
Because, and we have to be very relaxed about making mistakes when we're doing these reforms.
Well, mistakes are an opportunity for redirection.
What's that?
Mistakes are an opportunity for redirection.
Exactly.
I'm interested in the division, which seems to have occurred now across both days 1 and day 2, that there is students and then there's staff, because quite often they are the same thing, that there's a high level of casualisation of employment within universities and an enormous amount of employment precarity for people who occupy those positions. So there is a question here about, are you concerned with the rising tide of insecure employment? Are you concerned with the rising tide of insecure employment? Of
course we want to provide in our institutions good opportunities and good careers. If people are spending all of their time worrying about the next opportunity they're going to have at the expiry of their current fixed-term contract, that's not likely to encourage their self-confidence or loyalty in you. At the same time, students who are not seeking to be staff look at it very differently. We engage, as many institutions do, very large numbers of students to provide professional services for the institution. I'm not getting to the academic terrain here, I'm in the professional staff train. So I think it's mixing and matching. I think on the academic side, I think we're pretty well through a lot of the traditional academic arguments about tenure. I think we're pretty well through because we've got a system sectorally and within institutions which is more performance driven, and I think those debates are not to be encouraged. The point I'm really making is, if people have an appropriate level of security for the roles they have, I don't think there's an issue. If they don't, there is.
It's a question close to my heart. Is there a role for humanities-based research in your call for unis to concentrate on industry-focused research?
Well, one of the really interesting things about our place is that we set up the world's first creative industries faculty 15 or 17 years ago. We did so because we recognised that the two major competitors in our town, Griffith and UQ, were doing the traditional arts and humanities really well. We thought, given our branding as a University of Technology, we had to think about those disciplines in a different way. We looked at the way in which the creative economy was emerging, particularly in the Blair period in Great Britain, and we decided to devise a faculty around that, which has its own industry and professional links. But the thing that has been surprising in our institution over the last 10 years has been the closeness that now characterised relationships between the engineering, science and the creative disciplines. 10 years ago, that was a big distance. It's not now.
So I think most of Australia that worked in those disciplines looked to QUT as a leader in that area of industry-focused, non-STEM research. But it hasn't really shifted the research debate itself, which remains very grounded in where STEM is and not other disciplines.
Well, I'm not arguing with that proposition. I think that's right. But I'd say something more than that. I'd say that one of Australia's strategic risks is that nearly all the focus around government-funded or publicly funded R&D in our country is around biosciences and medical research. Now, politicians and governments are attracted to medical research because they see an ageing population, they see community need. The community also likes medical research because they see solutions to serious problems in the community which can be addressed quickly, and there's good television coverage in 20-second news clips. The problem is that Australia has many major R&D challenges outside medical research, and it is the sugar hit associated with, the political sugar hit associated with medical research, which is, I think, the danger for the country, because we have big issues around climate, we have big issues about engineering infrastructure, transport, agriculture, the opportunities to engage in the region in those areas. So I think it's not even a STEM issue. I think it's the to an extent understood focus on medical research to the exclusion of almost everything else.
Yes, including even some questions like coexistence, which is an issue that can't be solved by a STEM discipline alone, and yet is one that I think will manifest itself going forward in a world where there are diminishing resources and increasing call on those resources as a critical problem that we face as a nation and as a world.
Yeah.
And you know, the limiting of the research agenda to 9 core questions is deeply problematic as we shift into the future.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure whether the number should be 8, 9 or 14, but it's also important that the national research strategy not be a taxonomy of 300. It is legitimate to say Australia has a number of priorities. Some of those are part of, if you like, an international firmament. Others might be peculiar to our country, might be peculiar to our region.
I'll finish up with one more question from the screen. There's a question asking you what might the strategies be that you can suggest for these joining up reforms that you suggest are quite important now, that we're positioned in a place where really we need to be working on joining up effort.
I think it's actually quite hard. It's hard. This is hard politics because we have a system in which schools are the responsibility of the public sector at the state level, with, of course, a strong private and church involvement and independent involvement in our country. We have a vet system which has had a traditional TAFE component with a mix of Commonwealth and state. You've had a growing private component in that area. You've got 2 regulators involved in complementary ways, and I think it will require bipartisan support, certainly at the federal level, to muscle up and to understand that if we're actually serious about the opportunities for typically, but not only young people in the next generation or so, then we've got to think about those issues. But we're not likely to address it unless we're unified by one thing, and that's got to be the interests of the students and as people.
Thank you, Peter.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, everyone.